There arose a flat Earth movement in the 19th century, late 19th century particularly, a fascinating history there you need to look into. And there's a bunch of books written then, and the thing kind of peaked about 1890, 1900, and then it very quickly waned in the early 20th century and just about went away. People think about the Flat Earth Society. There have been several of those going back to the mid-20th century. Many of those were tongue-in-cheek. They really weren't serious. But this whole thing was reignited about 5 years ago using social media and the internet. Only I can figure some people stumbled across some of the books written well over a century ago and kind of reintroduced them into the world today. And I first became aware of the movement about 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago. And the movement has made huge inroads among Christians. In the Flat Earth movement, there are many non-Christians, but there are many, many Christians who insist they're flat earthers because they think that's what the Bible actually says and teaches.
It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Dr. Danny Faulkner, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Falling Flat, A Refutation of Flat Earth Claims. Danny, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Well, you're brand new to me, Danny. This is the first time you and I are ever talking, so let's start our conversation today with a bit of what you might call the Danny Faulkner origin story. So like me, most of my listeners are encountering you for the very first time. What are a few of the things we need to know about you?
Okay, I was born again at a young age, age 6, Vacation Bible School. Grew up in a Christian home. My dad pastored a small church when I was growing up. And so I've been a Christian and a creationist most of my life. I do have a PhD in astronomy. That's my calling. I decided that when I was age 15 in high school, 50 years ago. And after I finished up graduate school, I took a job at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster, where I taught astronomy and physics for more than a quarter century. 7 years ago, I had an opportunity to retire a little bit early and did that because I wanted to pursue creation ministry full-time in my retirement. So I made those plans. They made me Distinguished Professor Emeritus, by the way. That's the first time in my life my name and Distinguished have been used in the same context. I've been here for 7 years at Answers in Genesis in northern Kentucky, where I'm the staff astronomer. I'm on the research staff. I write, I speak, I travel a little bit, but usually I stay here home-based. And since I've been here, I've written 4 books, I believe, and a raft of articles and other things that I've done.
We'd love to have you talk to us a little bit more about when you either saw you had a knack for or you discovered you had an interest. You've got degrees in physics and astronomy. Like, how did that come alive for you at a young age? Did your mind just work that way, or was it a fascination sort of a thing? Like, where did that interest level begin to take shape?
Definitely a fascination, but I'm a little different from most scientists. Most scientists were fascinated with all sciences when they were kids. To me, science was just another subject in school. But I had a burning desire for astronomy from my earliest ages. I can remember a lot of stuff before I started school. I remember sitting on the front stoop of a house looking up in the sky. I guess it was summertime, and looking at the stars and being fascinated and talking to some of the kids in the neighborhood. And I was not quite yet 5, judging by where we lived at the time. So growing up, I always would go to the school library and get both the books on astronomy and read them and stuff. And never really gave it any thought, though, until I started high school. At least thought of doing it as a career. And a number of things came together my sophomore year of high school. And I realized for the first time that that's what God made me to do. And when God calls you to do something, he prepares you. I think he prepares you intellectually, he prepares you spiritually, he prepares you with your interest and desire in something, or he makes that in you at some point. He generally doesn't call you to do stuff you're not very good at. And so I do believe I am truly doing what I was made to do.
And you shared earlier that you grew up in church, came to faith at a young age. A lot of people would say that, faith and science, those two have to be mutually exclusive. I'm curious for you, as you went deeper and deeper into the sciences and just did more and more with your studies, was there ever a time you struggled to reconcile the two, or did those two, from a worldview perspective, always work really well together for you?
Well, I think they work together pretty well. Most of science is not about history or origins. It's about how the world now works. We call this experimental or observational science, and that's when science is at its best. But when we get into trouble is when scientists try to muse about what might have happened in the past. And, the past is past. So consequently, we can't really test it the way we normally do scientific ideas. So I don't see a problem at all when science is operating at its best. I think we run into trouble when we start extrapolating into the past, things we cannot observe, things we cannot test. So I've had very little struggle with it. I see a huge difference between this experimental observational science and what people call historical or origin science.
Let's transition now into the book. I think for those of us who maybe are uninitiated, we are outside of the flat earth conversation. I think a lot of us had the assumption that maybe 5 centuries ago with Columbus, this whole idea, is the earth round, is the earth flat? That was something that was settled. Yet we find ourselves at a time when flat earth theory has come back to the surface. It's emerged as a concern for some people here in the 21st century. Like, why has this all of a sudden kind of found a new heyday among some folks?
First of all, I need to correct one thing. This issue of this Earth's shape wasn't settled 5 centuries ago with Columbus. It was settled 25 centuries ago. We had numerous people in the ancient world. 350 BC, Aristotle wrote the Earth was a sphere in his book called On the Heavens. We have Pliny the Elder in the 1st century AD giving arguments for the Earth's sphericity. We have Ptolemy in the early 2nd century doing much the same. And some of their arguments are still very good arguments today. So we got a bit of mythology that arose in the 19th century about the whole Columbus deal. People also confused it 400 years ago with what we call the heliocentric theory and the geocentric theory. It's true that until 4 centuries ago, most people in the West thought the Earth was the center of everything. That shifted around 1600 or shortly thereafter. And I think that leads to part of the confusion. Now, there arose a flat Earth movement in the 19th century, late 19th century particularly, a fascinating history there you need to look into. And there's a bunch of books written then, and the thing kind of peaked about 1890, 1900, and then it very quickly waned in the early 20th century and just about went away. People think about the Flat Earth Society. There have been several of those going back to the mid-20th century. Many of those were tongue-in-cheek. They really weren't serious. But this whole thing was reignited about 5 years ago using social media and the internet. Only I can figure some people stumbled across some of the books written well over a century ago and kind of reintroduced them into the world today. And I first became aware of the movement about 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago. And the movement has made huge inroads among Christians. In the Flat Earth movement, there are many non-Christians, but there are many, many Christians who insist they're flat earthers because they think that's what the Bible actually says and teaches. And I disagree with that strongly. And the church has never taught that, by the way, despite what people seem to think. But this movement is having a deleterious effect. We're getting this question quite a bit at Answers in Genesis. Other creation ministries are getting it. We're being accused of not following Scripture and teaching the wrong cosmology. I've been personally called a liar and all sorts of other things over this. And I think I'm uniquely qualified being an astronomer, a person who's keenly interested in what we call aspects of the sky and how these things cannot be explained by the current model that flat earthers like, and also my knowledge of Scripture. So I've been writing and speaking on this for 3.5 years, and I collected a lot of it together and recently published my book about the subject.
Well, in terms of Christians being drawn into this sort of flat earth movement, what scriptures are they pulling from where they say, look, here, the Bible supports this concept of a flat earth? Where are they going in the Bible for that?
They go all sorts of places. There's a claim of well over 200 Bible verses that say Earth is flat. I've looked at all of them, and I just don't get it. You'd think if it's so clearly taught in Scripture, somewhere there would be a verse that says something like, the Earth is flat. They go about it several ways. One of them, they like to turn to the creation account. It talks about this thing on day 2. The King James translates it as firmament. Modern translations oftentimes say expanse. I'm sort of partial to the Hebrew word rakia. God made this on day 2 to separate waters above from waters below. And then on day 4, when God made the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, the stars, he placed them in this object, to this thing that he made on day 2. And people try to argue that, flat earthers try to argue that this thing is a solid dome and it sits over top of a disk Earth. Now, you have to do a lot of eisegesis. You have to read into the passage to get that. There's some liberal scholarship going into this back to the 19th century that tried to argue this very point. I like to tell people that you're really using the devil's argument. The first people who tried to argue that the Bible teaches a domed flat Earth really were the skeptics and agnostics of the 19th century. And a lot of these people don't realize that at all. But they also point to other passages. They talk about the ends of the earth mentioned 28 times in the Old Testament. Sometimes they mention the corners of the earth mentioned in Isaiah, I believe, and also in the book of Revelation, 4 corners of the earth, more specifically. They also mention the Daniel 4 dream of Nebuchadnezzar, a tree that grows so high that could be seen from all over the earth. And so that can only happen if the earth is flat, because if it's a sphere, you can only, at best, only half the earth could see it. Some talk about the Lord's return, how everybody will see him, and how can that happen on a spherical earth, but it could happen on a flat earth. At the temptation, how could Satan have shown Jesus all the kingdoms of the earth from a high place or high mountain if the earth is not flat? Those are the kind of arguments that generally are put forth here.
So we've talked about appeals coming from Scripture. What sorts of appeals are flat earthers making, say, from science and research?
The one they really like to talk about is examples of objects that are visible over a great distance, usually over water, that would not happen, you would think, if the Earth is a sphere. The best example they're giving in recent years is several photographs actually, taken of the Chicago skyline from across Lake Michigan in southwest Michigan, 50 to 60 miles away. And if you do the calculation of how much curvature there is, the Earth's curvature would obscure almost 2,000 feet of Chicago. And yet some of these photographs show the Chicago skyline. And to them, that's just a slam dunk proof that the Earth must be flat, because if it's curved, we wouldn't see such things. And there are other examples too, lighthouses and things like that. That's a simple sort of concept. A lot of people are really convinced by that because it makes a lot of sense to people. But I can explain it. It requires atmospheric conditions of warm air and cold water. And that is the regime almost every day during spring and summer, when people are likely to be paying attention. However, if you do this is called a temperature inversion, and there's some physics involved. It's kind of complicated to describe, unfortunately. I do talk about it in my book, of course. If you do the experiment when there is no temperature inversion, this means looking out over a large body of water on a cold autumn or winter day. I know that that's not a comfortable thing to do because I've done it. And I show in my book some photographs I took of a couple of container ships that were leaving the port there at Newport News, Virginia, heading out through the Chesapeake Bay and out in the Atlantic Ocean. And as I did, I took photographs with a really long focal length telescope. And you can see progressively the hull slowly disappears from the bottom up, and then the layers of the containers start disappearing. That's exactly what you would expect to see on a spherical Earth. A lot of flat earthers proclaim, show me the curve, show me the curve. Well, I've shown them the curve repeatedly, and when I do, I get into silence. They just don't say anything to me. I don't know if they think I'm faking or lying or what's going on, but it's very frustrating because they demand evidence. I give it to them, and then they say nothing about it.
Let's go a slightly different direction. In terms of something like the flat earth and people who are going to be drawn to this sort of a theory, a lot of times this is where you can get into sort of that conspiracy space. And so talk to us about some of the problems, some of the concerns that the flat earthers have with NASA. How is NASA trying to deceive us?
Oh, boy. Well, you got to realize that if the Earth is round and flat with a dome over top, then nothing can orbit the Earth because you can't break through that dome. Anything above that goes around up in the sky has to move in circles or some sort of other path right above or some distance above the flat Earth and below the dome, i.e., nothing can orbit. The moon can't orbit. We can't launch satellites that orbit, so there can't be any astronauts. And, of course, we've never landed on the moon. And so if that's the case, then NASA's been lying about everything for 60 years. And they go on and on and on about these things. They take videos and countless hundreds, maybe thousands of hours of videos from the space station, from the Apollo landing, still photographs, and they try to point out what they consider to be fake. They say all this stuff is CGI, that NASA just pretended to do all this stuff. Of course, most of the stuff like the Apollo landings happened long before there was CGI. If somebody's in their 20s, it's easy to believe that CGI has always existed. But believe me, it hasn't. I remember the first Star Wars movie came out in 1977, and they used a bunch of little toy models. Later on, in a later version, shows they made some CGI stuff, but it was all done with little models. There was no CGI involved in any of that back then. They argue all sorts of other things. They say that in Hebrew, the word NASA means to deceive. The word they have in mind is nashah, which sounds nothing like NASA to me. They're digging kind of deep for that one. I've looked at many of these videos and memes that people have put out claiming that NASA lies, and I don't see it. I don't get it. And in fact, I have found a number of them where there was indeed trickery and fakery involved, but the fakery was coming from the people who were trying to convince me that NASA lied. You know, when you're trying to prove to me that NASA lies, you better not lie while you're doing it. And I've caught these people in several lies. They try to argue, for instance, they show a photograph of one of the astronauts on the moon, the Apollo program 50 years ago, and there's the Earth sitting in the sky, pretty low in the sky, and they correctly point out that all the lunar landing sites were near the middle of the moon, and so that we see when we look up in the sky. So the Earth couldn't have possibly been that low in the sky, which is true. All of that is true. However, when you look up the original photograph, the Earth isn't there. The Earth was added by somebody along the way. I suspect it was some people trying to convince you that NASA lies. So I think many of these memes out there and videos are being put together by people who are lying of themselves. They're playing a prank. And the flat earthers, unfortunately, because they so want to believe it, they just fall hook, line, and sinker for these pranks.
I'm just thinking about, say, the average person listening who they might be like, I don't have a stake in this disagreement, this race, if you will. You know, I'm fine with the Earth being round. I'm not really worried about whether or not it's flat. But I guess my question to you would be, what's at stake? Why is this important? Why should we care about this disagreement?
I've seen it have a deleterious effect upon people. They get upset because their church doesn't teach it, and if their church doesn't teach it, they keep pressing and pushing, trying to get their church to teach it. They finally leave the church. They can't find one, so they just check out. You got people now, Christian folks, who aren't going to church, aren't part of a local body, which is direct violation of what our understanding, our commandments are given in the New Testament. I've had testimonies from family members, spouses, people who their spouses are into this, and it's turned them into somebody else, or sons or daughters or parents that have gone way off. And these people end up taking some really strange positions on a number of things. They kind of become sullen and withdrawn. They get filled with all sorts of conspiracies. They're paranoid. It's unbelievable the effect it's having upon people that I'm seeing. And I think that's ultimately very bad.
I don't disagree with you at all. We talked a little bit about this before the interview. I've been to a number of conferences and events that I guess you might say would fall more into this, what I would describe as the fringe space, where people are talking about Nephilim and UFOs and flat earth and all these other sorts of things. And I did see a very common theme amongst the people drawn to that sort of a conference, where if you just sat down at dinner or grabbed coffee and just engaged in conversation over and over again, I would hear people saying, well, I tried to talk to my pastor about this. My pastor didn't really have anything to say about this. He didn't really know anything about it. This is such a big deal. The world's being deceived. And, you know, I come to this event or this conference because these are my people. They understand me. And because of this one hill to die on sort of issue, they do kind of self-exclude themselves from Christian community and gravitate towards any place where somebody will feed this obsession and talk about this one thing. It's almost like all of the Bible and all of salvation and everything hinges on these single issues, which is kind of a scary place to be.
And many people are attracted to this fantastical sort of stuff, no matter what it might be. I think people have this thing that attracts them to secret knowledge. I've compared it to one of the elements of Gnosticism in the first few centuries of the Christian era. One of those elements was the belief that you could have secret knowledge, that when you learn it, it would make you initiated, you would have a higher level of spirituality. I've read testimonies from people. They believe that they're drawn closer to God. They read Scripture more and with better understanding. And I think it's kind of a shortcut to spirituality. If you just know a few things, then that suddenly elevates you higher. And that attraction is there in many different things, Bible codes, end-time prophecies that people are consumed with. If you mention the Nephilim, UFOs, the gospel and the stars, even very legalistic terms where people make a list of what good Christians do and what good Christians don't, and it's a way of keeping score. If I score higher than you, then I'm more spiritual than you. So I think this is driven ultimately by pride and by a shortcut to get to true spirituality, and that's not how you get there. Spiritual maturity is hard work. It's not easy, and this is just a quick and dirty way of getting there, I think. I understand the attraction, but that's a wicked thing ultimately.
Well, I think Gnosticism is definitely a good comparison. That definitely makes a lot of sense. Let's circle back around here as we begin to wrap up. In terms of argument out of science or an argument out of scripture, would love to have for the person who says, I have friends who are interested in this topic or they try to engage me on this topic. What would be those top one or two arguments out of scripture and science for why the earth is round?
Okay, from scripture, we're left a little short. I'm of the opinion that the Bible doesn't give us a lot of specifics on cosmology. It does give us some specifics on cosmogony, which is the origin of the earth and the world around us. God created heaven and earth in the beginning. He made light on day one and divided it on day one. We have this expanse made on day two. We have dry land and plants on day three. We have the astronomical bodies on day four, and then the living things, plants and animals, animals on days 5 and 6, and man. But there's not a lot of specifics given there. And I think we have a lot of freedom then to examine the world and to learn some certain things about it. The Bible doesn't tell you how long the month is. We can measure that. The Bible doesn't tell you how long the year is, but we can measure that. That's basic nuts and bolts astronomy. And some people try to come along and say, well, if it's not in the Bible, I'm not going to believe it. I only want to base everything on Scripture. Well, Scripture is silent on a lot of things. And I think the details of cosmology are silent. I get challenged all the time from the flat earthers. Just show me one verse that proves the earth is a spinning ball. Well, the closest you can come is Isaiah 40. And it speaks there about the circle of the earth. But I've talked to Hebraists, and I asked them, okay, this word for Hebrew there, circle, does it mean a two-dimensional circle, or does it mean a three-dimensional ball? And the answer I get from my Hebraist friends are, yes, it can be either. And anybody who tries to claim it has to be one or the other to the exclusion of the other is not dealing honestly with the text. So God's not revealed all that to us. Is there scientific evidence then that the earth is a sphere? It's abundant. My favorite is looking at eclipses of the moon. We know that it is the shadow of the earth falling on the moon. Now, flat earthers will deny that vehemently, but there's abundant evidence that that's indeed what's going on. And the reason why they deny it is because the earth's shadow is always a circle. The only shape that always casts a circular shadow, regardless of its orientation, is a sphere. This is something anybody can do for themselves. So the flat earthers want to deny, they want to take that proof away, that evidence away, because they want to deny that the Earth's shadow can actually fall on the moon. But that's exactly what's happening on a lunar eclipse. Another argument I like to use is as you move northward and southward, the angle that the North Star makes changes. As I went to Edinburgh last year, almost 60 degrees latitude, the North Star was almost two-thirds the way up in the sky. I went to South Florida back in February, and the North Star wasn't even a third of the way up. And as you go northward, you lose stars in the south. You gain them back as you head southward. From the southern hemisphere, you don't even see the North Star. You see a bunch of other stars you can't see from the northern hemisphere. That only happens if the Earth is a sphere. It cannot be explained on a flat Earth. These are the kind of things that a person, if they really want to study and pay attention and do the research on their own, observing these things, they can see for themselves the Earth is indeed a sphere. You don't need NASA to show you photographs. You can do that for yourself. And by the way, Aristotle and many other people 2,400 years ago noted the very things I'm just telling you.
And Danny, if you had to sum it up, let's say a reader gets to that last page of the book, they close that final flap. What's the one message you hope each and every person hears loud and clear as they interact with this material?
I want them to carefully consider what I've written and examine for themselves the scriptures I talk about and the evidence I talk about. Don't take my word for it. Go on and research it for yourself and test what I say with what you actually read and see for yourself.
And Danny, for the listeners who would like to find out more about you, check out your articles, your other books and resources, where should they go on the web for that?
Our website at Answers in Genesis is answersingenesis, all one word, .org. And there we have the book for sale. We have a DVD for sale about flat Earth. We also have at least 17, 18 articles on our website that I've written. I'm going to be writing more. Stay tuned. We have plenty of resources on that and many, many other topics. It's fully searchable.
Well, and like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places where you can connect with Danny and find additional resources, including this book. So just head on over to ShaunTabatt.com. We'll have that all linked up for you right there. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Dr. Danny Faulkner. Once again, our book today was Falling Flat, a refutation of flat Earth claims. For more on Danny and the book, a great place to start is the Answers in Genesis website. Once again, you can find that over at answersingenesis.org. And Danny, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to have you on the show.
Well, thank you very much.